welcome everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here today with all of you, and really an honor to have the chance to moderate this discussion. We have a really remarkable panel of leaders from the region who are here to speak today about two topics, both a macro and a more individual level topic related to gender equality. Obviously, over the last few years, we've seen quite a lot of changes in the working environment. COVID-19 has had a major impact on gender equality and women in the workforce. And so it raises a lot of new and interesting questions about the role that the public and private sector need to play in terms of collaboration, but also more importantly, not more importantly, but equally as importantly, how we as individuals should be engaging and supporting women as allies from both sides of the table. So very, very thrilled to be here to have these discussions. We have 5 panelists joining me today. I'd like to give them all an opportunity to introduce each other before we start to jump into our discussion. The discussion will take place in 2 parts, and then we'll leave some time at the end for a brief conclusion. So please, Anne-Marie, if you would introduce yourself, that would be great.
Hi, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here today, especially with this week, being very active this week in terms of diversity in the workplace. So Emory Campbell, currently the Chief People Officer at Allyship Group, which we work across 18 countries with 51,000 employees. I've worked in the Middle East for 15 years. Originally in Abu Dhabi, then Dubai, then Qatar, and now I'm currently based in Kuwait.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. Saliha, if you would introduce yourself as well.
Thank you for having me. So yeah, I'm Dr. Saliha Afridi. I'm a clinical psychologist and the managing director and founder of the Lighthouse Arabia, which is one of the largest mental health centers in the region with over 30 clinicians. And we work with everyone across the age range. I've been here for the last 14 years now in the UAE, and then sort of seen how the mental health arena has sort of, has grown in the last decade, or especially in the last few years. But I'm also coming from the space of being a working mother. I have 4 children, 3 of them teenagers, so times that by 2. So I have 8 children, and as an entrepreneur as well. So coming from all of those, bringing all of those hats to you guys today.
Wonderful. Diana?
Hi, so my name is Diana Wild. I'm the co-founder of Aurora 50. We are a social enterprise that's working with the leading organizations like ADNOC, Mubadala, and Etisalat to drive gender balance in the boardroom and within C-suite. I've been here for nearly 18 years now. I'm also a committee member for the Association of Corporate Treasurers, an advisory board member for a local startup combating food waste. Also a mother, also understand that pain point and how challenging that balance can be. Just delighted to be here with you today and looking forward to taking part in the conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Diana. Bob, if you would introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, hi, Elena, and hi, everyone. I'm Bob Willen. I think we have a lot of Carnies on the call, so probably don't need to introduce myself to them, but certainly welcome to everybody else on the call as well, and to our panelists too. Dr. Saliha, it's great to have you back with us too. I know you've helped us in so many other ways too. I guess my experience crosses 3 geographies now, a lot of time in the US, but then also working about 5 years in Europe out of Brussels, and then for the last 7 years in the Middle East. I think like a lot of our panelists too, I think when we look at these important issues, we also think about the context with which we work, in which we work. And, you're always, I think, thinking about different experiences, different cultures. Yet I think many of the themes are so consistent, which is really taking full advantage of all the talents that we have to offer. So really keen to join this and hopefully I can add something to this incredible panel we have.
Thank you, Bob. I'm sure you will. We've got lots of great perspectives. Jess, I will hand over to you now so you can introduce yourself.
Sure, thanks, Elena. So my name's Jess Groot. I'm one of the defence advisors on a Carney project in Abu Dhabi. I come with 12 years of being a uniformed military officer in the Australian Navy. I deployed with the Navy several times. I'm a mum and I'm a wife. I'd like to think I'm some other things other than those hats as well. We all want to be multi-dimensional. Occasionally I get some fitness in there as well. So yeah, lots of different perspectives to bring to you today. I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. Thanks for joining us, Jess. And for those who've just joined, my name is Elena Siegel. I'm a partner with Carney in the Middle East. I've been living and working in the region for over 11 years. And I have gender balance and equality very much deep in my heart. I also am a mother and have had the opportunity to work recently with the Gender Balance Council in the UAE and developing parental leave policy options to help expand the leave that's made available to parents to help increase gender equality in the country. So very thrilled to be here today to talk both about public-private collaboration, but also what we can do as individuals, as allies. So let's kick off with that, focusing on our first topic, a more macro topic at the public-private collaboration level. So I'd like to start, if it's all right, Bob, if I might kick the first question over to you in terms of your view on how the government should be playing a role in achieving gender equality in the workplace, if at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think the government has to play a role to kind of set expectations about, maybe certain aspects, regulatory or let's say broader objectives. I have a view, though, that, the government can't make it happen either. The more of the work, more of the lifting has to be with organizations, with each other, in terms of education, awareness, and, just taking steps and learning about what works and what we need to do better. Certainly, and again, like I said in my introduction, I think seeing how different regions treat these issues too. I think, if one falls back and expects the government to do everything, we won't get very far. It has to be, I think, really driven more through the lens of, taking advantage of the talent that we all have, that women have, that, and you can extend that even to broader aspects of diversity. So that's my view, and I think the government is there, certainly should lend support where necessary, but I think it has to be put in the right context.
It's a very interesting point in terms of putting it into the right context, because obviously, Bob, we do a lot of work at Carney in the government sector supporting on regulatory and legislative activities, and yet at the same time we are a private organization, so the regulations that we're recommending also come into play affecting us as a company in the region. I guess a quick follow-up to that, and then Anne-Marie, I'd like your perspective as well, as the Chief People Officer for one of the larger private organizations in the region and in the UAE. What are some of the benefits that companies might see from regulations or legislations or government intervention, but also where do you see challenges for that? Are there challenges that you would expect to experience as a private organization with regulations that might be put into play that could impede gender equality?
So I think because I cover multiple regions, so we cover Europe, but also the Middle East, that we're a Q80 company. So if you look at Q80, the laws and policies are very different than Bahrain, Saudi, and the UAE. And the UAE always seems to be at the forefront. And having spent the majority of my last 15 years in the UAE, they are ready for those policies. But you have other regions, Saudi, I mean, it's moving fast, but Kuwait, Bahrain, there's a time and a place for the government to step in and put these policies in where it can help, because the maturity of the region and the organisation can cope with it. But they can also have a negative impact if countries, regions, and companies are not ready for it. So if you put in, legislation to do with gender specific, it could actually have a negative impact where people will avoid, recruiting females because they don't want to be held to the legislation.
Mm.
So you can actually do more damage. If you're in the UAE, it's very much open. It's a lot more mature, and you put that legislation in, you know, people will say, this is great. You know, we've got the support, we can put the policies in to support it. But I think it's a balance. And when you're an organisation that works across region, you have to be very balanced in what you do, because you can't offer females one support in one region and not in the others. So I think it's not as simple as can we have the support? Yes, you know, I think it works, but I think also there can be negative consequences if organisations aren't ready for it. I think there's a lot of groundwork that needs to be done. You know, the stick approach is good, but we even know that in Europe it didn't work. You know, setting quotas, setting legislation, calling organisations out for pay gaps, it did a little bit, but did it change anything systemically? You know, the research would suggest it hasn't. So I think for the gender equality or general diversity, then there is a big push. You know, employees are expecting more from employers. So in terms of attracting and retaining people, it's to the benefit of the organisation to have those policies anyway, and make the organisation attractive. So I'm not sure how beneficial they are. I think it doesn't. I think it fixes a symptom, but doesn't fix the cause. That, you know, that there has to be a change of how you approach the entire diversity subject in organisations. Picking off individual groups just can actually end up isolating them even more.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. A lot of the research does support that. There's a balance, right? So I think, you know, the private sector will, I think, often act in a way that enables them, as you said, to attract and retain talent. But at the same time, there's it's oftentimes to the minimum of those requirements. Saliha, I think you had something you'd like to add on this topic as well.
I think if we just look at what we went through in the last few years, I mean, technology was always there. Zoom was there, video conferencing was there, but we were just resistant to that change. And that is because there is such a thing as status quo bias, where people are resistant to change and maybe even afraid of it. And so when governments mandate a change, such as a gender quota, now, that just comes from the top down, great. Of course, there needs to be shifts that need to happen. We need to do capability building within organizations. So it can't just be that meet this quota, check a box. You know, it's like a domino effect does go into play in order for you to be able to do all the things that you want to do in the best of way as an organization in the private sector. But I do think the government has a massive role to play in it. And we saw the major it needs to be, at the rate that we're going, we're only going to get there maybe in 200 years. But in order for like a paradigm shift to happen, which is what we just encountered in the last couple of years, where we are now not all flying in from all sorts of places to come sit next to each other, but we're using, you know, WebEx to actually have this conversation. That was a paradigm shift that happened. And we were sort of forced into that place, and then we adjusted. And so I think these quotas, etc., policies do need to be in place for a transition period in order for us to move out of our status quo. And then at some point it will stabilize.
Diana, have you been hearing similar things from some of the board members and the women in the executive levels that you've been speaking to through Aurora 50?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's very much like the panelists have been saying, it is striking that balance. It is making sure that we implement the policies that are needed to help move people along when they are perhaps more in that sort of laggard category, but also not implementing things that are going a step too far. So it is being very mindful about the culture that exists and making sure that the right steps are taken. If we look at what's happened within the UAE, as an example, you know, we had a comply or explain rule for having one woman on the board that's been in place since 2012, but then it was enforced in terms of it being a quota last year. Now, I believe a lot of that is because actually the community, because the private sector were speaking up more and actually saying the behavior we want to see from these boards is that they actually do go looking for the talent, because the talent exists. And because there is a disconnect here, because there is a network gap, it can be a little bit difficult on both sides, right? So we can speak to the boards and they'll also share frustrations that they want the very, very best talent, but they also recognize that there's this network gap. So by putting in that policy, it means that everybody is going to work that little bit harder when we're looking at finding talent. That's what we want to see. And I think from ESCA's perspective, what they want is high performing financial markets. They want to make sure that these companies are performing and that we are attracting that foreign direct investment. So the requirement is all very much aligned. Obviously, that we've always wanted that from ESCA's perspective, but it's about when can you push things forward? When is that environment ready for it as well? And there will be some people that struggle more than others, obviously, depending on where they are on that bell curve. So I think this is where it's important that we pull out more of those champions and ambassadors and have them sharing the story and helping people to move further up the curve in understanding that this actually does drive performance. And then at the right time, you put in these policies to make sure people that still aren't shifting actually start to do that and understand why. But I also think it brings the conversation forward to those regulators of what the challenge is, what the difficulty is, for other people then to be able to come in and provide support where it's needed. So I think, when you look from sort of one country to the other, it will be very, very different depending on where they are, and depending on what that talent pipeline looks like, depending on what the economy looks like. But certainly there needs to be, everybody plays a role, and there needs to be a government perspective of what their role is, and they need to actually make sure that that's very clear.
And I guess in this, I would open this up to the group a little bit, but where do you think the most productive areas of public and private sector collaboration could take place on this? Because one of the pieces that we've certainly seen in our work on the topic, and I myself have had many discussions on, is that active collaboration between the public and the private sector is actually fundamental. It isn't necessarily, as you said, about putting legislation or regulations in place, but it is looking for those areas where the government can be supportive of these advances. And in some cases, that might be a regulatory response. In other cases, it may be something much softer. From your view, and I would open this to the whole panel if there's someone who'd like to jump in first, where are some of those areas that we should be looking towards more collaboration between the public and private sector? Perhaps, Jess, you could give a perspective from the defense sector.
Actually, I'll share something that I learned at the World Defence Show this week, actually, which I found really interesting. It comes from Women in Defence UK, and they have just, or not just, for the last 10 years, they started as a very small foundation. Now they have, many, many thousands of members. And what they've shown is that the partnership between the government positions and the industry positions within defence, those relationships form the best mentoring and coaching relationships. So they've been able to form partnership within defence industry and uniformed members or civilian defence members within the MOD, etc., to be able to really provide that step up and a different perspective for women. And I think that that's a really interesting sort of way of approaching it. What we find, obviously, is once you see it from the other side, you have a bigger picture. I know myself, it's one thing to be in the military. When you step out of it, and in this case, I'm advising back to a different country's armed forces, your perspective changes and you see things differently. So they have certainly found that by doing that to their mentoring and coaching program, it has improved that outcomes of that program and improve the objectives of that program. So I found that a really interesting example of looking outside the box for their solution. Thanks.
I think that's a great example. And actually, it's something where, while this is government to private sector in many respects, it's also a model that maybe can be adopted in a slightly different way from a private sector standpoint. So also, I think there's a mentoring and coaching aspect that can kind of go both ways, both from public to private and private to public. Anne-Marie, what is your view on where, as the Chief People Officer for Al-Shaya, where do you see opportunities for the private sector to collaborate more fully with the governments in the region, both in Europe and the Middle East, since obviously you're covering multiple regions?
So having worked in the Middle East for both public and private sector, I can see it from both sides. I think regionally what is really powerful is when the government appoints and promotes female leaders, because I think it takes away a little bit of the mystery of, that, if you can be successful in government in the Middle East as a female, then any female can be. It's such a powerful, strong message that, the promotion through women through that way, I think makes people stop, makes people look, makes females think I can achieve that, because the perception of so many boundaries to get to that role within a government is really strong. And then that feeds back into government organisations, and then it feeds back into the private sector, because everybody always wants to see what everybody else is doing, and there's usually then a gradual knock-on effect that, we need females, or we need a wider diversity. What is really interesting in Kuwait, where I'm currently based, is Kuwait is one of the first, well, I think it was the first country in MENA who actually had a female agenda. So going back over 15 years, they had a very strong female agenda, and the government here are pushing daily, you see in the newspaper, that we need to have more females in leadership positions, probably why this is my current role. But what's interesting, if you look even outside the government, within Kuwait, there has been a huge change in ambassadors. So predominantly still male ambassadors, but within the last 12 months, 10 females. It's a huge, huge shift. I think that then puts the pressure on private organisations. So it might not be a direct partnership, but there is without a doubt a link in the region of what happens. I don't think I see that so much in Europe, in the other organisations. I think the pressure, the peer pressure, if you want to use that phrase, comes from private companies to private company. But it's like, what are they doing? What policies they have? We want to attract talent. What do we need to do to beat our competitors? So I think the private to private is slightly different. But within this region, the power of government standing up, maybe not policies, but making statements of what the agenda is, and that we really want to promote this is more powerful. And then I think you will get the links, but the strong messaging for me over the 15 years is that monumental shift of talking about women all the time. It doesn't drop off the agenda. Every couple of years it's the year of females, and it doesn't stop. And I think that keeps people on the toes. I think where we're lagging in the government and the semi-government sector is the approach of, we'll do a quota and we'll tick the box, but you're not actually changing policies. What makes you attractive as an employer? So for me, we are really struggling to attract females, and why there's a war on talent, but what are we missing as an organisation that makes women say, I want to go and work there?
Yeah. I think I think you've raised an interesting point, which is actually, especially in the Middle East, where the government have quite significant influence, both through fully public sector organizations, but also through these semi-private organizations that are both, but that not just the announced agenda, but the action of naming women into roles of power and influence and leadership, the modeling of that also creates a lot of momentum, I think, through many different dimensions of the economy around the gender agenda. And some of that has to do with making the region, I think, more attractive to women as a place of opportunity for professional achievement. Diana, if I can ask you, some of that. So you are working with a number of women who are at very senior levels in their organizations. You mentioned to me earlier that you've just completed a research paper on that. So, these are the women who actually become the models for many of our private sector organizations, become the role models for younger women who are entering the workforce in the region or considering the region as a destination for employment opportunities. What are you hearing from them as well about some of these public and private sector interactions? Do they see a need for it? Is it something that they feel really needs to be driven primarily by the private sector, as Bob was mentioning?
Yeah, so we established a group called Manarat, which means lighthouses, which is a networking group essentially for women who already hold seats on listed boards. And the purpose and help them to network with each other, but also have a group of women who can actually shine a light on what they've done and to share those experiences. And I think that's so incredibly valuable to those women who are obviously coming through the ranks, to have those women who've already achieved those NED, those non-executive director roles, and especially those within those listed boards. So that research report really looks at, giving advice to women and to their organizations of how more support can be provided, and how we can accelerate this. I think what's always very interesting is that they do typically look at it as, the first question is, what can I do for myself? What can I ask of my organization? And quotas is something that comes up time and time again. And I think it's one of those subjects that can be very polarizing. One of the things I don't think people can argue with is that it does actually typically get the job done fast. Again, though, it needs to be at the right time, the right place. Where I do think government has a huge role to play, and something that we see the UAE doing very well in, is actually leading by example, which I think is already kind of been brought up in terms of making sure that you're putting women into those senior roles and you're providing examples of women who are leading. People that you can inspire, look up to, that can inspire others. We've also seen the same happening because within the boardroom, because a lot of the shares are essentially government shares, right? They are the shareholder for those businesses, and they're making sure that what they want in terms of seeing women in leadership is also shown within those boardrooms. And I think what's very interesting about that is that it actually exposes people, women that may not have been appointed otherwise, to a board. And that then has that sort of trickle-on effect, because these women are obviously very, very successful, very accomplished, that they're placing, that they're appointing, and then other members of the community get to see just how amazing she is. And of course that sort of trickles into the other parts of the private sector, where they say, oh yes, we definitely want her perspective and her views in our boardroom as well. So we do see this sort of happening in other parts of the world. I think it's just, the most difficult question is sometimes, should it be a quota? Should it be voluntary? What is that role? And every government has to look at that and decide for themselves. But this, going back to your point with the research, I think this is a crucial piece. If we don't share what we're learning from the private sector with government, it's very difficult for them to know as well when the right time is and what sort of policies to put in. So I think there has to be this this joint relationship for us, feeding back and forth to make sure that actually the decisions are made at the right time.
Yeah, Absolutely. And I mean, certainly in the UAE, I think the gender equality pledge that was recently launched in February, speaks exactly to that. And one of the pieces that they're setting up is an advisory council for the private sector and those who've signed the pledge to provide input to the government so that there is actually dialogue back and forth. And it's a two-way street. It's not a push down of regulation that the government thinks is best, but actually it's something that is developed in a much more collaborative spirit so that it both achieves the necessary outcomes, but also empowers and enables the private sector to be competitive and successful without creating excessive burden, shall we say, which is always a challenge with a regulatory solution.
Yeah, and I think that's what private sector wants too, right? Is to be heard, and to be able to have an outlet for that. So we're working with the Gender Balance Council as well, and it's whether it's central bank regulating, whether it's ESCA regulating, whether it's a body like the GBC putting in more sort of policies and recommendations. I think that's a really important way for private sector to feed back. And we need to make sure that the companies are doing this.
Yeah, absolutely. Very briefly, we're in the last 10 minutes or so of this particular topic, but I did want to touch a little bit on the impact of COVID-19 and the pandemic over the last 2 years. I think one of the pieces that has emerged in the last few years is actually the pandemic slowed down a lot of equality and in some cases worsened dimensions of gender equality in the workplace. Obviously, many companies are working to try to counterbalance that. However, I think it would be interesting to hear from each of you how you've seen the pandemic affect the dynamics within your workplace. And are there elements that would be supported by government action to help address that as we continue through this journey of the pandemic over these next months, which hopefully we're seeing the waning of COVID-19 finally. But as we look towards that future, is there an area where the government could be supporting the private sector more to address that in this very acute period still of the pandemic? Bob, maybe if you have some thoughts on that from the work that we do in the government sector, that would be lovely to hear.
Well, I think certainly the last couple of years have taught us all quite a bit. I mean, it's challenged us and it's taught us. I think Saliha said as well that some of the technology adoption has been remarkable, right? Some of these technologies have been around for a long time, yet we never use them. Now we use them and they're kind of second nature to all of us. So I think that's certainly a positive outcome. Going back though, Elena, to the question about sort of the government facilitation, maybe in this context as well, I think, certainly there are ways where maybe the government can extend its reach more through some of the new technologies. Yet, when I think we come back to creating maybe opportunities for women, setting the right programs or policies for progress, I'm not sure I see a big change there. I don't know if this changes much. I guess I'm still in a world, and I think we all feel this, is that I'd like to get back together in person much more than we have. Whether that's with our government clients, our government as a, steward of the economy, our government as a regulator, with each other. I think any form of in-person interaction will be better. I'm not sure I agree with the premise that maybe, I think a lot of business imperatives have been sidetracked a bit over the last couple of years. I think that's just true in general, but it's been disruptive on so many levels in that regard. Yet, at the same time, it's also, many, many different aspects of business and our operations have been disrupted over the last couple of years. So anyway, I'm not sure if I answered directly the question, but maybe
I think you did. I think you answered the question very well, which is that, much of this still needs to sit within companies themselves. And a lot of the government interventions, while there may be opportunities for support, the driving impetus needs to come from the private sector to solve many of these issues in collaboration with their employees and the technologies that are now available. Any thoughts from the rest of our panelists on this topic? Do you see a different point of view from Bob in terms of the role of the government in supporting during the pandemic, or is this something that you also feel should be primarily driven by companies and their organizations internally?
I think not in terms of what the government can drive, but something that was mentioned earlier, you know, there was a paradigm shift, a huge seismic shift. But what I think it did, and it has done, and I was speaking to peers last week about it in terms of the gender equality, did they see any change? And they said that because of the remote working, that people felt the work-life balance was better. So although we had the awful homeschooling, so you know, also I went through that myself, was that the balance was there, you know, that you could work from home, people could see you were productive, and that you could also, you know, look after your family, whether you're male or female. So I think that is something that people don't want to let go of. You know, I know, you know, people do like face-to-face interaction and people want to get back in the workplace. But I think if we try to remove that flexible working that people have had, and organizations know we can still be successful, you know, we can still do remote. The feedback we're getting is that for particularly female staff was more important. So if there was one good thing that came out of the last 2 years, was that it's recognized that you can work from home, which means that you feel less stressed. You maybe not rushing out in the morning, getting the kids ready for school, you know, having the whole guilt, the parental guilt, both for males and females, is that there's a feeling that it gave a little bit more balance to it. So I think the adoption generally, and one of the things we just did a survey was, what are people looking for from an employer? And the top one is flexible working, the ability to choose where they work. And when we ask the reason why, and it is to accommodate their life outside of work. So there's been a seismic shift, I think, over the last 2 years. And if an organisation tried to force that back in, I think there would be big problems. So a little bit of a side conversation, but in terms of what happened during the pandemic and post-pandemic, if there's one positive, I think, particularly for females, was the ability for flexible working. And it showed where people were always a little bit cautious about it. You know, we must see people, they must be in the office, we must know what they're doing, was that removed that. And by naturally removing it for everybody, it gave a little bit more of a level playing field for females with family.
I think, can I just add to that?
Oh, sorry, Celia, go ahead.
No, Bob, it's okay. I'll go after.
No, I just a quick follow-up. I think it's really important what Anne-Marie's talking about too. And, you know, I think for many, certainly of our folks, I think at times we've heard the opposite, where the balance, you know, maybe the separation between work and home, that we lost track of that. And, you know, we've intruded on personal lives far too much. You know, we've had significant work-life balances all over the world, or work-life balance concerns all over the world. So it's not just here. I think it's interesting what you said, though, too. I think parents have a particularly acute view on this, too. You know, maybe it has to do with homeschooling and then having to manage in a different way the day and all of that. You know, you have probably different perspectives at the like. I think the hope is that we can try to capture this and maybe take all the good, Anne-Marie, that you talked about. But we as an organization have to be much better at then respecting the limits that need to go with it too. I mean, there's a time we all need to shut down. So, Celia, over to you.
Yeah, so I have the privilege of sort of knowing what's happening on the ground and behind the scenes as we work with so many clients, and especially in professional services firms. And And I mean, the facts show it that, you know, whether we wanted the flexibility, but 42% of women reported being burnt out by 2022. Once we hit 20, it was really that it really did take a toll, and there was that blurred line. I think the key word here is choice, not just even flexibility. I want to see people in person. I want to be with people, and that sense of community is absolutely essential for people's happiness, retention, development, growth. Presence is important when we are with each other, so we can actually respect each other more and share each other's differences, etc., etc. But I think when that choice is taken away by an employer or by a government, that's when things start to get a little bit tricky. So I would just add to flexibility the word choice.
I think that's an excellent point, Saliha. And actually, I think this also helps us to now start leading into our sort of individual level topic around allyship and the balance of power between men and women. And I think actually one of the pieces that emerged in the pandemic was that in many households with children, women were still actually continuing to carry a significant amount of the responsibility at home when it came to homeschooling, when it came to managing things within the household. And I think that very much, Saliha, as you referenced, contributed to the level of burnout a lot of working mothers started to feel over the course of the pandemic. And certainly, you know, in my discussions with, you know, colleagues and friends around the world who have children, that was one of the pieces that they constantly referenced, was this need to suddenly be all things to everyone at all times, with no distinction between them. You were both working as a professional, acting as a teacher, maintaining many aspects of the home. So I think one of the pieces, and we can talk both within the professional environment and perhaps also within the home. And I think before we started our formal panel discussion today, we already started to talk about this, but gender equality is not a zero-sum game. It should not be set up as, you know, men have to give up in order for women to achieve, or, you know, it needs to be a bit more of a balance of power. But I do think many times people do perceive the topic of gender equality as a little bit more zero sum. So it would be very interesting, and maybe Saliha, you can start with us on this topic about, you know, thinking a little bit about the balance of power and influence. You know, how do we want to think about navigating that between men and women so that it doesn't become a zero-sum game or a real, you know, conflict between the two genders?
Yeah, I think the narrative has been men against women, women against men. And I think we just need to, first, I wonder who asked that question in the first place, because this question has been asked for many years now, but I imagine it was a man. And it really does feel that it's the wrong question. When we phrase the question as a man versus woman issue, where one person is winning and another person is losing, then we really get into a power struggle. But if we just sort of zoom out a little bit and we say, what is good for our society? What is good for our economies? What is good for our communities? What is good for our families? Everybody wins. And the research is done, and it does show that women, when you add women to boardrooms, when you add women to teams, when you add women to cabinets, there is something different that they bring, and that is actually helpful in the bottom line, whether you look at the bottom line as being a community, a sense of community, or if you're just looking at just numbers even. And that female leaders did respond to COVID better, and the outcomes did improve when you involve women in these kinds of conversations. So I think if we are just looking at, well, there's 2 seats and I got to give one to women and one to, like, if we talk at this level, then yeah, okay, fine. Someone's going to have to give up something, right? But I think the conversation is, if we keep having the conversation at this level, this is the level we will remain. But if we zoom out and we actually look at the big picture, everyone wins when you involve women.
Absolutely. Diana, perhaps you'd like to build on what Saliha has started this conversation off with?
I 100% agree with her. You know, I think this is not a zero-sum game at all. It's very well documented that organizations perform better when there is gender balance. And if that pie is bigger, clearly there's more responsibility, there's more work to be done. So I think the really successful organizations who understand that are already, you know, this is why we say that there's this war on talent, right? Is we want to make sure that we're actually getting to that point where we have balance. And this is then a responsibility for us to actually build up more of that talent pipeline and to plug those holes from the leaky pipeline that we have, to make sure that actually when you're getting to those decision-making leadership roles, that we have a really strong female talent pipeline to select from as well. So I think that, you know, I think one of the wonderful things to kind of take a positive out of COVID is that this discussion has been very much pushed to the forefront. Whilst it was obviously awful that women were sort of almost pushed to the brink at times, or perhaps maybe just my view of it sometimes, but you know, it was very, very challenging. In the beginning, we were talking to organisations, and it was very much, no, we don't want to talk about the gender issue right now because we're in crisis mode. We have to work out what we're doing. And then that very quickly turned to, my gosh, maybe women are the answer here, actually. Like, maybe they can help us to balance this out, and what can we do to actually come back much stronger and make sure that our teams are working properly together and that we're focusing on efficiencies and effectiveness rather than that sort of binary way that people were looking at it before, clocking in, clocking out. So I think there's a lot that we can feel very blessed for over the last couple of years as well, because it has really pushed this conversation to the forefront. And like Anne-Marie was saying, we have a paradigm shift. So this gives us the opportunity to reinvent really what that future is going to look like. And certainly with the organisations that we're working with, that makes me excited. And I think this is where both men and women come into that conversation in terms of saying, well, how do we want that to look in the future? What do we need to change? What choices, as you say, do we need to be allowing people to make for themselves, so that we can actually build these much stronger organisations and ensure that there's real resilience in that process?
I can just add, I absolutely agree with both of you. There's a couple of words, the word power, I think, you know, you drop that because it just has so many connotations. You know, it's not about power. And, you know, the minute you start to talk about men vs women, which is why I try not to talk about gender on its own, I try and talk about inclusion and diversity, because, you know, it's multifaceted. It's not gender, you know, anymore. It's huge. If you have a mix of people around your top table from different nationalities, different cultural backgrounds, different upbringings, different, you know, it can only add. It adds. And one thing I always reflect, I think if you take a country like the UAE, is it is so successful because it is a huge melting pot of the whole world condensed into one area. And I am true believer that has something to do with it. And if you can mirror the success of the country within your boardroom, then it can only add value. I think the narrative has got to change. You know, I constantly ask, how does it feel to be the only female? You know, and I'm kind of, well, I don't know, because I never question it. I don't see myself as a female CPO. I'm a CPO. And as far as I'm concerned, chief people officer means people, any gender, any ethnicity, but it seems to be more of an issue to my male colleagues than to me. You know, and I think the only way you can do it is it is great to talk about it, but it's also, there comes a point that got to change the narrative, because if you keep talking about gender inequality, which is super important, it is always going to be about men and women. So we're in a bit of a catch-22 of how we position diversity and inclusion rather than talking purely about gender.
So I'd love to kind of jump in on that as well, because I think this is this is one of the reasons why what we're doing at Aurora 50 actually has worked to an extent. So we set out in the beginning with the view that both men and women actually want this, and that it's difficult. And we just wanted to sort of help bridge some of the challenges within that. And I think we always kind of approached the men that we work with as well in saying, you know, we know this is hard. We can see that there are challenges, that there are barriers, that you don't always have the best visibility of the talent pipeline. We want to come in and actually work together. And it was just an amazing response. And I think this is one of the things that, you know, we find really, really inspiring is we meet, you know, man after man after man, and maybe Bob will add to this, but who constantly say, absolutely, of course we want the very best talent, of course we want this to happen. And then, you know, start explaining maybe where some of the challenges are that they're seeing, or kind of saying this is actually what we're really looking for. By getting that transparency into the process, by actually understanding some of the blockers and the enablers more, we've found we've been able to actually help men be enable more of the change as well, and that it's been very much a welcomed move. So, you know, we initially brought mentors in, we bring in male non-executive directors into the initiative that we run, and we've certainly seen really great responses to that, because I think there is a longing from both sides for change, and that people want to be able to actually be active. And not necessarily just talk about it, but actually do something that they can say, that was something that I did to have an impact and feel proud of. And sometimes we need more sort of, you know, for tackling the boardroom, because it is talking about sort of bringing externals who aren't necessarily within the same organization, and we definitely need that cross-pollination, and we need those collaborations, right? When we're looking more into the actual organizations, there's probably something more Anne-Marie can talk about, but the same still exists, right? If we can help people connect those dots, I'm always amazed at how much help men are willing to provide, and how excited they actually are about the prospect of doing that. So I think it's to talk about zero-sum game, agreed. This narrative is just so wrong and outdated, and we need to stop doing that. But maybe Bob, you know, being the only man on the panel, maybe you would like to share your views in terms of what you think about it too.
I think this is a very powerful segment of the panel so far. I mean, I really agree and respect with everything which has been said. I guess I was thinking of, you know, just different examples I've seen, and, you know, this idea of the zero-sum game. I think, you know, maybe there's an example where there's one open position and there's a man and a woman both sort of vying for it as candidates, and automatically it becomes a gender discussion. And that's not right. It's not appropriate. And, you know, people start assuming somehow that there is a zero sum. And they lose sight about all the other things that go into it. But I think what I find more than anything is it's incredibly small-minded, I think, maybe short-termism in thinking that just because of this one choice that, you know, anything can be really concluded from that. So, you know, I see that in different ways, you know, with different colleagues who are concerned about this, concerned about that. But, you know, we do have to step back and think about growth, about the community, about development in different ways. And that's not a linear path. That's a complex path. Yet we have to be willing to make investments in so many different ways to get a better result, to get a better outcome. I think, Diana, to your point, you know, I love the introduction of allyship to the discussion as well, you know, let's say the broader discussion, because I think, you know, there are ways where it's very tangible and very direct, you know, to put someone in a position, let's say, but there are so many other ways where I think men can help women advance, progress, to develop, you know, so allyship is such an important kind of term, and it embodies, you know, a range of things that can be done, you know. But I would say, I think, Diana, you summarized it well. There is a willingness to help. There's a real commitment to help. I think a lot of men are not sure what to do about it. They're not sure how to act, you know, so the intent is there, but I think we also need to, you know, helping everyone find ways to be constructive.
Maybe I could jump in on.
Yes,
sorry.
I was going to say.
Jump in on that one. I think you're right, Bob. I think most men and many men do want to help, but they're not quite sure. I think, you know, I've seen it on the other end as well. From a serving members point of view, I think I've seen positive discrimination, right? And this doesn't help us, because when we're suddenly thrusted into positions in order to be not necessarily part of a quota, but sometimes we turn into poster children as well. And I think that this can be dangerous, because the position is made from a place of goodness, right? They want people to be there. But if we're there and we feel ourselves we weren't necessarily the best person for the job, or we're not there 100% on merit, then all of a sudden the things that tend to creep in for women a lot more than they creep in for men, regardless of the situation, things like imposter syndrome and all these other things really start to take hold. And if this happens at earlier stages in our career, you know, it can be really damaging, because then we feel like we're not the best person to advance. So we may be made as a poster child, we may be fast-tracked, but if we haven't been supported up until that point, or given the best foundational skills up until that point, we're sort of like a hollow being moving forward. And that really worries me. I think one of the things I learned last week was the concern about women making it to senior leadership positions in very large companies, making it to board positions. But one of the critical skills they're seeing that was missing for those women was actually financial acumen. So they had all the other skills, they were suddenly thrusted upon a board or a leadership position, and then the board sort of turned around after a few sessions and said, oh, actually, you don't have the skills to be here. But they were never given the opportunity to develop those skills, because they were fast-tracked along the way. So I think we need to be really, really careful in the assumptions that we make in progressing women and moving them forward on fast tracks. And while it comes from a good place, the foundation has to be there first.
Leah, maybe you could speak a little bit about the challenge of imposter syndrome. A lot of the research says that, you know, many employees, whether they be women, people of color, people of other minorities, you know, often they have a lack of confidence and they do suffer from imposter syndrome, even if they are equally as qualified as other peers. If they're not seeing others like them in positions of leadership, in positions of influence. I think there's a question of, you know, I think we know women typically suffer from that much more than men do, or at least they act on it much more than men do, I think. But it would be good to hear a little bit of your perspective on that, because that may also be a misperception.
I've had so many people ask me this question about imposter syndrome, because it has the word syndrome, and I'm a psychologist, so that should make me an expert on this topic. But I just have a real big issue about, you know, just the idea of, let me just zoom out for a second and just say, what is an imposter? An imposter is someone who deceives and assumes a character or an identity. So that's the definition of someone who is an imposter. I've worked and I've had the pleasure and the honor of working with many senior men, C-suite men, senior partners, et cetera. I've never had them use that word imposter, although they might have had their confidence, you know, rattled, or they might have had difficult conversations, but they've never said, I feel like an imposter. To me, the fact that women feel like imposters just tells me that they're at a table where there's maybe just one of them, or maybe there's two of them, and they're questioning, am I in the right place here? Because there's just not that many of me around, right? So I don't know if it has to do with confidence or ability or capability. It's just, if a man makes a mistake, but there's 9 of them, and then I make a mistake and there's just one of me, I'm gonna question myself more, simply because there's just not that many of me. So I think it's more a systemic issue that women feel more like imposters, because they're just in places where there's just not that many of them. I think if you come to our clinic, which is mostly female-led, you're not going to find people that feel like an imposter at that table, just simply because they're not wondering, should I be here? Am I in the right place? So yeah, I think again we go back to we're asking the wrong question here. This issue is the wrong issue. If we talk about the real issue, is why is she feeling like an imposter and not just feeling like she has a lack of confidence maybe in a new role? Why isn't she using those terms? That to me would be the real question. Because if a man was not if he made a mistake, he would just feel like he's not confident in that role yet she feels like an imposter.
Very interesting framing. Sorry.
Can I just
please.
ask a question? I'm just genuinely curious, is where that phrase came from originally?
Yes, it came from women also, actually. It was actually coined in, I think, in the 70s or maybe in the 80s, but more and when women started to enter the workforce, they actually, they felt like imposters, and and a lot of people actually link it to low confidence, and they link it to low self-esteem. But I actually think that that's the wrong framing here. I actually think it's because they're in a place where they look different and they feel different. And that goes for any color or any race or any religion. I think if you're different, you're going to feel like I'm deceiving people by being here because everyone else looks the same except me. So anytime you have a difference in presentation, I think you might feel like an imposter.
I just find it quite interesting that 50 years on, we're using such a negative label for ourselves. I think people have thought I'm an imposter, but I've been lucky, I've never felt imposter syndrome. But I find it interesting that women would use such a negative phrase 50 years later to describe the situation they're in. Because isn't it just
I could be wrong. I'm gonna just do like maybe it was a little bit later than the 70s.
But even if it's now, it's such a negative phrase.
Decades at least.
But it's such a negative phrase. Why are we using it? It's a self-fulfilling negative phrase.
It is a negative phrase, but I actually think it actually does show to a deep-seated insecurity that women do have because the systems are not in place to necessarily support that. I know women who, we go back to allyship. I actually would like to use the term sponsorship. Ally is one thing, but will you stand next to me and will you defend me and will you amplify me and my presence? Will you boost me when when we are in a meeting? I think men need to be sponsors of women, especially when there's not that many of them in a room. And I think that's the term that really resonated with me, that who are you sponsoring? Because that's an active commitment that I'm doing something for you today, rather than I'm your ally, which then we sit together and we talk about it once a year. But I tell you I'm your ally, but there's really no action backing it up. And so I think women are using that term because it is an internalized value system or system that says that you don't belong here. So I don't blame women for using that term, but I actually think that term says a lot more about the system than it does about women's insecurities.
I'm not suggesting that I blame women. I just think then we should stop using it and find a better way to describe how we are. But it's interesting when you say about sponsorship, and I think it circles back to what Diana was saying and Jess a little bit earlier, is that men do want to help, and I think we have to help men to want to help. So I can count countless times where something has been said in a meeting, and then afterwards they've come up to me and said separately, away from their male peers, oh, I should have said something about that, or I shouldn't allow that to happen. And and that's where the sponsorship is, because if you were a true sponsor of me, you would have spoke up. But then there's a recognition that's very uncomfortable for them to do, and it's a journey as well at the same time. So I say my view is but I can't be the person who always calls out the female agenda. It can't always be me. I don't want to be the flagship person for females. I'm here to do a job. It just so happens I'm female. I think as I've got older and later on in my career, I now feel a sense of responsibility towards females. That necessarily maybe before I didn't, but I think around the table, they need to be able to say, you know, thank you for coming and telling me, and thank you for saying that you should have spoke up. Or I went home and I spoke to my wife and I told her what happened, and she was, why didn't you say something? You know, and I said, then when next time it happens, say something. So it's a journey, isn't it? Because it's people also stepping, you know, into, or just speaking out generally in support of people, you know, regardless of what it's about. It's uncomfortable because you become exposed by standing up. But it was very interesting. I like the word sponsorship. I think it's something we should use more.
Yeah, I happen to agree with both of you on the topic of sponsorship. So I personally have been fortunate in many of my career stages to have sponsors, both men and women. But one of the pieces that I have found most interesting about the concept of sponsorship rather than just allyship is that sponsorship actually means that both parties are benefiting from the relationship. So not only is a sponsor standing for and defending the individual, and quite frankly, it could be male or female. I think quite often informal sponsorship has happened more man to man or male to male or female to female, and what we actually need is more cross-pollination between men and women on both sides of it. But it is that act of saying, I stand for this person, but they also stand and support what I'm doing. So there is a positive feedback relationship that exists within a sponsorship, which is very active. And I think that's a key defining characteristic of sponsorship that actually does bring it into a much more positive element. And it is something whereby, you know, when we talk about that balance of power, and I say this from my own personal experience, you know, I don't want to be in a position where I feel like I'm being given something, as Jess said, and as Diana said, as everyone has spoken about today, where I'm being advanced simply because I'm a woman. I want it to be on my merit. I want it to be something that it's because I've proven my capabilities and my value to the role, to the organization, and in our case, in consulting to my clients. So, you know, that sponsorship activity also helps to open up those opportunities for proving the value and the contributions that can be made.
Elena, I just want to pick up on a point you made there about that activeness, right? And I think that's my issue with allyship, because it's a noun, and I want the grab hold of and embody an action. And you know, allyship was the word of 2021. And so I find it really interesting that it became this suddenly this very sexy, fun word that we have now. And yet I wonder ultimately how we can embed it and actually make it an action. So returning to our earlier thing about what can men do and what's their role, well, what is everybody's role? Because Emory said she doesn't want to be the one always calling out the behavior. So it doesn't matter if it's a male calling out a behavior in response to something that's happened to a female, or a female calling out a behavior in response to something that's happened to a male, but calling out that inappropriate behavior, because that should never be a water cooler conversation, right? If you see something, you should say something. But also say the names that you know, recognize people, cross to people in meetings. If you're at the table and somebody hasn't had the opportunity to say something, and yet you know this is their field, they have something of value to add, throw them a ball so that they can catch it and they can have their moment of shining. You know, I think that is a genderless thing that we can do for anybody in advancing anything, because in order to, you know, advance diversity, we need to advance cognitive diversity. So to be able to do that, we can do that through any of these things, and gender doesn't become an issue anymore. The other thing I've really noticed in the last hour of us talking is we always sort of seem to return back to this phase of this phrase of seeing at the table, the women at the table, the men at the table. And, you know, again, we have this idea of these leadership positions, and are we measuring these leadership positions? As a workforce analyst, this sort of grinds my gears a bit, because we need to consider diversity across every cohort of people that make up an organisation. And so segmentation to me matters. I read a really interesting study a while ago about pay disparity across the genders. And yet, you know, one statistic, they looked at different countries. One statistic in Australia was that there was a 23% pay disparity across genders. That's pretty big, and that's a pretty big problem. When you break it down and you look at the same level within the same 0.8%. If you look at the same level in the same company performing the same function, the pay disparity actually drops down to 1.4%. Now, while that suggests I may not be like championing the rights of women and diversity, I'm actually saying that measurement matters. So if we look at quotas or if we look at government legislation, any of those things, policy, what we need to be very, very clear about is what we're measuring, what is our objective, and how do we measure against that? Because otherwise we're just throwing a generic measurement at a generic problem and not being able to drill down into what's actually going to result in change.
I think that's an excellent point, right? Measurement does matter. How we think about it matters. But, I think also your point about, having a seat at the table is not just the answer, right? It is much more than it is much more dynamic, much more fluid. And as you said, it has to happen across all levels and all cohorts for success. Can't just be at the leadership level, even if that is the level which may provide sort of inspiration or aspiration for the younger generations and younger cohorts.
Absolutely, it does provide that aspiration because you can't be what you can't see. But equally as important, I think that we know, let's take a spending type of equation. We know that women globally spend a larger proportion. We're in charge of spending a larger proportion than men. But teams that actually have just one representative of whatever minority that product is being targeted for, perform at 158% better. So do you know what I mean? You could have any minority person sitting at that table and that team is going to perform better when targeting that particular audience. So it doesn't matter what level it is. That table may not be the leadership table. That table might be a table of junior consultants putting together a smaller package that might have a bigger impact.
I'm just going to comment, sorry, if that's okay. I do agree with what you're saying, but having spent 30 years in an organisation and across all the organisations, and you look at why is there less women across the entire organisation, so whatever level, and then you start drilling down, is, if there's more men interview men, and so it starts at the very beginning. So people are attracted to the organisation. If it's predominantly men leaders will recruit historically male leaders. So you do need women because it sort of starts breaking that down. That, you can't just have men interviewing men, you can't have women interviewing women. It has to be a balance to get that fairness. But we're talking about breaking down years and years and years and years of nobody being that person to drive that agenda. So we look all the time when I'm in an organisation and say, why are more men getting promoted than women? Because there's more men in the organisation in senior positions, and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So we need women across the entire organisation. But I think unless the leadership recognise that it does make a difference to have different genders, at the senior level, they're not going to recognise that's why you have issues throughout the rest of your organisation. So I agree with you, but I think that it just brings a different perspective because nobody would look at it before or ask the questions, because predominantly females in an organisation are a little bit exhausted. A lot of the women's I speak to across organisation is that, I just give up, but you're a senior person in a company. Yeah, I've got a seat at a table, but I don't have a voice, and there's a bit of, people are fed up. So I feel like there needs to be a big injection of, we really need to look at the granular level. Why is this happening? How do we stop it happening? But also females are getting tired. It's kind of, I'm fed up. There's a generation where have been battling for 20 years and fatigue's just hitting, and they've said it's just easy just to go. So there's a responsibility on females as well as the males to sort of give it a bit more energy and start saying, this isn't, right, we have to change it. But they need the energy and they need somebody, to say, okay, I'm here, I'm behind you, let's do this.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, this is where that some of that sponsorship dimension becomes so critical in, because you have to have someone who makes that first step into the roles where they didn't exist before. And oftentimes that takes the support of the cohort that has dominance in that organization or that industry or whatever it is to support and sponsor and enable those individuals to step into new roles so that they can become role models. But the support does, I think, Anne-Marie, to your point, women do get tired. I think we probably, as women, have all felt that fatigue at some point or another in our career of having to push and represent and fight. And at the same time, it is something that, you can't just stop, but it does, once you reach the top level, it doesn't mean the support also needs to stop for you from those who are sponsoring you. And I think that is the piece that I think we all continue to look for in my peers that I speak with, is that continued support and collaboration across the leadership levels so that it doesn't just become tokenism of a small representation that's now reached a top level, enabling, and acting as sort of the poster child, as someone referenced earlier, for women or persons of color or other minority groups, whatever it is. It's tiring, and it is not a burden that ends just because you reach the senior levels. We have just about 10 minutes left or so. We've been having a very, I think, wonderful and dynamic discussion so far. I would like to ask maybe some slight closing questions as we've been talking about this, very much related to the idea of sponsorship or support. And I'd like to give each of the panelists a chance to answer these questions. The first is, the question of what advice would you give to women who are working in male-dominated industries today? And the other side of that coin, of course, is what advice would you give to men? So we've talked a lot already in this discussion about how men often do want to help, but they don't know how. And it would be wonderful to hear from each of you, your advice for both men and women in how we can continue to advance this and collaboratively make achievements in creating greater diversity and higher levels of inclusion as we look forward into the next years. So Anne-Marie, since you actually just finished, maybe I'll let you continue on that note, and then we can move to one of our other panelists.
I don't know what else I can add, because I think I've been quite vocal on on my thoughts. Is interesting. We did a diversity coffee morning this morning, and I got asked the same question, and I always do struggle to answer it, because there isn't just one answer, is there? There's not just, well, if you do this, everything's going to be fine. I think the only summary I can come up with, and I'm not sure what percentage of it answers the question, is that don't put yourself in a box, because we are very good just as human beings of stereotyping people and putting them in boxes, and there is a huge world out there who will readily put you in the box. So my advice would be to the females is don't put yourself in a box, and if you feel like you're in the box, just step out. That sounds a lot easier than it is. For males, I think I mentioned in my introduction, I have had the most supportive male managers, sponsors. I've been extremely lucky, and those have become very good friends of mine, throughout the years. And I think, is to encourage men too to take that role, because it's very satisfying for them. It is still predominantly, I don't know whether I want this on record, it's still predominantly a male world, or we wouldn't be having this discussion. So if you can have sponsors or relationships, then it can only help and it can only benefit. I think my first ever mentor was a male, and I did that deliberately. I did it deliberately because I wanted to learn how it worked. I wanted an in. And so I suppose if you're a male and there's a female knocking at your door wanting an in, then help them, help them succeed.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. I think that's a great piece of advice for both sides, actually, men and women. Jess, would you like to take the next?
Sure, thanks so much. I think the advice I'd give to men is to ask a really simple question. You need to ask people, do you need to blow off steam right now, or do you need me to offer you a solution, right? Because sometimes if you see a female who is frustrated by a situation, you're not quite sure how to approach it. And I think sometimes males just running that other direction instead. Sometimes I think, it's advice that you can offer a friend. It's advice you can offer your husband. And it should be advice that you feel free in a safe enough culture to offer a colleague, a peer, a subordinate, or a superior. Like, are you trying to blow off steam, or is this a moment you're looking for my guidance? Because they might say, actually, I'd really like you, to offer me some guidance in this moment about how I can move past this or how I can advance. For females, I'd say it's three things for me. It's build networks. I can't stress networks in your life enough. I think we need to make a real effort to make sure that they're not just super, super strong networks, but within one circle. You need to be broader than that at every opportunity. I think it's live by design. I think our careers and our lives are one thing that we really don't sit down and build out a plan necessarily. If you're building a house, you build out a plan, and then you create an idea of what it's going to look from the outside, and then how you're going to furnish it or how you're going to wire it and all of these sorts of things. So build a plan for your life. Know what your next step is going to be. Work out who you need to ask to get to that next step, those sorts of things. Take advice from the experts in that next step. And live by gravitas, not guilt. So that to me is by leading with some level of emotional intelligence. I think that you can be graceful under fire, and try not to bubble over. I think they're the three things for women for me. Thanks.
Thanks, Jess. Bob, if you'd like to go next, that would be lovely.
Sure. I think this has been a great discussion. I think very good. Too, I feel like my support of allyship was not enough because everyone then quickly jumped to sponsorship. I mean, I think we need all of it, right? I mean, we need absolutely sponsorship, and that is far more powerful and impactful in the end. But I guess then I was also just reflecting a little bit, and this is for all the male colleagues on the call too. I think to go back and amplify Jess's example, sometimes it's simple. Right. Sometimes we just need to get the basics right. And your example about, someone who didn't speak in a meeting, right? They have something to say, something important to say. Take that opportunity and ask what's on their mind, and it certainly is the case for women. It's the case for anyone. And I think it's also about your own self-awareness that someone is in the meeting that hasn't contributed. They have probably something important to say. If we can get those basics right, then you can really build on that and maybe go the next day at something a bit more, the day after it's something yet more than that. So, it's, I think, a very powerful example, Jess, that you brought up, where, these are the little things we can get right. We get more of those right, then we can start to do much more of the sponsorship that really make a difference, and it's very much needed. So I guess that's my my last thought. But again, really, really pleased to be a part of this and have everybody join as well.
Thanks, Bob. Saliha, if you will.
Thank you. This was a great conversation. So I think I would say three things to all men and women. One thing I would say is that we are all biased. I think it's something that we think is the other and only the other holds, but every single human being by design is biased on to some degree or another. And unless you are conscious of those biases, you cannot do anything about them. If you are not sure about which biases you have, I really encourage you to take the implicit association test, which is if you just Google implicit association Harvard, you will find that. And mostly we are biased by primary sort of reasons, which is your race, gender, and age. And so these are going to be the primary triggers of your biases. If you think you are not biased, that's dangerous. And I think that is the first thing that I would want to say. Performance bias, attribution bias, likability bias, status quo bias, these all exist in all of us. That's the first thing. The second thing I would say that while men need to sponsor women, and we've talked at length about this, know what to do, just ask the woman, what do you need in this moment and how can I be of support? And maybe they will tell you. And I think women need to mentor men, and men need to be more open to being mentored by women, because we have a lot we can teach each other. We have a lot we can expose each other to. You know, my husband, he is in the professional services field as well, and he used to sort of work in Saudi and come to the UAE, you know, on the weekend. So he was like the weekend dad, and I was like handling it all week long. And during COVID, he was like, what is this? Like, what have you been doing our whole marriage? And having to juggle kids. So he saw the burden of that. But like, if you would have asked, I would have told you, you know, like, so having kind of a day in the life of would be a really good experiment for most men to sort of, what is it like to be in the day of someone who is you in this company? And then the third thing I would say is that I wish that we would not have this conversation once a year. I wish we had this conversation once a month, and we kept it as an agenda item, as a standing agenda item in every meeting that we had. And that we don't just talk about sponsorship and we don't just talk about allyship, etc., but we really make it actionable. And how is that going to come into each and every one of our conversations and each and every one of our meetings? So those would be the three things that I would say to both men and women.
I think that's wonderful. Thank you so much, Saliha. Diana?
It would be no surprise that this is a conversation in our place of work every single day. And you know, we're delighted that it's happening more and more with more organizations. Just 2 points really, and I'm going to focus more on obviously getting into that C-suite and getting into the boardroom, because that's our focus area. So for women, can't encourage women enough to get profit and loss experience. Please go and get that experience, do it early, and make sure you grow that experience over time. Because if you want those C-suite roles, if you want to be sitting in the boardroom, this is something that, you know, is really going to accelerate your career in terms of growing a board portfolio. So for women, this is something that, you know, we really want to see happening earlier. And for the men then, you know, help a woman into that spot, basically, and help with access. So we do believe that there needs to be genuine intent and genuine interest from both sides to create that change. And I think a key thing that men can actually do is to, and shameless plug for organizations like us, but to actually work with our other organizations as well, to create those safe spaces so that we can have these conversations and create really pragmatic bridges. It can be very difficult for a man to start kind of approaching younger women within an organization to say, I want to sponsor somebody. It can be very difficult for her to do it as well. So, you know, sometimes it does need somebody else to step in and to create that environment. So I would just encourage men to kind of view it from that perspective as well and say, okay, what do we need within our organization to actually make to build those bridges, to make this change happen that we actually want to see, and to use the tools that are available within the market by working with others to actually make that happen. But yeah, the big one for women has to be P&L if you want to be sitting in those board roles, and we really hope to see a lot more women who actually have that skill base in the future as well.
That's great. Thank you so much, Diana. A lot of really great practical advice for both men and women as we look towards the next year and the next years. I'd like to thank, we are now at the end of our panel today, and I would like to thank all of our panelists for the incredibly dynamic discussion. We have covered a lot of ground in the last hour and a half, from the need for private sector to be a driver with the support of the government rather than being driven by the government, to the importance of active engagement, whether it's through formal sponsorship, informal sponsorship, but in both directions, from both men to women and women to men as well. So thank you all for this. I think this has been a wonderful discussion today. I'm truly thrilled to have had the honor to listen to everything you've had to say and to facilitate this discussion. And I wish you all a lovely evening. Thank you so much for making the time.